History of the Jews by John Murray. Book 1. Continuing from last time. In this manner, Hagar, an Egyptian slave, bore a son to Abram. He was named Ishmael. 14 years after, when Abram was 100, Sarah 90 years old, a new revelation from the divinity announced the surprising intelligence that Sarah herself was to bear a son. There is something singularly beautiful in the attachment of Abram to the first child, who had awakened the parental feeling in his bosom. He would fain transfer the blessing to Ishmael, and is reluctant to sacrifice the earliest object of his pride and joy to the unborn son of Sarah. But the race of Abram is to be beyond every possible impeachment on its legitimacy. Abram is commanded to assume the mysterious name of Abraham, the father of a multitude, as the ancestor of a great and numerous people, who were to descend from Sarah and become lords of all Palestine. The tribe were to be distinguished by the rite of circumcision, perhaps before, certainly afterwards, common to many people of the East, a rite of great utility, as conducing in southern climates both to health and cleanliness. During this time, Abraham had occupied his former encampment near Hebron. Here, as he sat in the door of his tent, 3 mysterious strangers appeared. Abraham, with true Arabian hospitality, received and entertained them. The chief of the 3 renewed the promise of a son to be born from Sarah, a promise which the aged woman received with laughter. As they passed forth towards the valley of the Jordan, the same divine being, for so he manifestly appears to be, announces the dreadful ruin impending over the licentious cities among which Lot had taken up his abode. No passage, even in the sacred writings, exhibits a more exalted notion of the divinity than that in which Abraham is permitted to expostulate on the apparent injustice of involving the innocent in the ruin of the guilty. Shall the city perish, he successfully asks, if 50, if 45, if 40, if 30, if 20, if 10 righteous men be found within its walls? 10 righteous men shall avert its doom. Such was the promise of the celestial visitant, but the guilt was universal, the ruin inevitable. The horrible outrage attempted against the 2 inferior of these preternatural beings who descended to the city, the violation of the sacred laws of hospitality and nature, which Lot, in his horror, attempted to avert by the most revolting expedient, confirmed the justice of the divine sentence. The valley of the Jordan, in which the cities of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Tsesboim were situated, was rich and highly cultivated. It is most probable that the river then flowed in a deep and uninterrupted channel down a regular descent, and discharged itself into the eastern gulf of the Red Sea. The city stood on a soil broken and undermined with veins of bitumen and sulfur. These inflammable substances, set on fire by lightning, caused a tremendous convulsion. The watercourses, both the river and the canals by which the land was extensively irrigated, burst their banks. The cities, the walls of which were perhaps built from the combustible materials of the soil, were entirely swallowed up by the fiery inundation, and the whole valley, which had been compared to paradise and to the well-watered cornfields of the Nile, became a dead and fetid lake. The traditions of the country, reported by Strabo, Tacitus, and other ancient writers, kept alive the remembrance of this awful catastrophe. In the account of the latter, the number of cities destroyed is magnified to 13. The whole region is described by modern travelers as a scene of gloomy desolation, precipitous crags hanging over dull and heavy waters, not indeed, as the local superstitions have asserted, devoid of life, for the lake abounds in fish, nor fatal to the birds which fly over it, but the specific gravity of the water is so great that those who cannot swim float on the top, and it is bitterly salt to the taste. Unwholesome fogs hang perpetually over the lake, and the stagnant surface is broken by clots of asphaltus, which are constantly bubbling up from the bottom. A distinguished modern geographer thus describes the present indications of the physical agency by which divine providence brought about this memorable destruction. The valley of the Jordan offers many traces of volcanoes. The bituminous and sulphurous water of Lake Asphaltitis, the lavas and pumice thrown out on its banks, and the warm baths of Tabaria show that this valley has been the theater of a fire not yet extinguished. Volumes of smoke are often observed to escape from Lake Asphaltitis, and new crevices are found on its margin. Lot, warned of the impending ruin, fled with his daughters. His wife, in contempt of repeated warnings, lingering behind, was suffocated by the sulphurous vapors, and her body encrusted with the saline particles which filled the atmosphere. Later tradition, founded on a literal interpretation of the Mosaic account, pointed to a heap or column of salt, which bore perhaps some resemblance to a human form, and was believed even by the historian Josephus, who had seen it, to be the pillar into which she was transformed. Lot fled first to Zoar, near the end of the present lake, then into the mountains. The tribes of Ammon and Moab, famous in the Jewish history, were derived from an incestuous connection into which he was betrayed by his daughters, who, according to Josephus, supposing themselves and their father the only surviving remnant of mankind, the rest having perished in the recent catastrophe, did not scruple to violate the laws of nature. While these rival tribes were thus born of incest, amid all the horrors of convulsed nature, the legitimate parent of the numerous offspring promised to Abraham is at length born. He is named Isaac, from the laughter of Sarah when the birth was announced. But now the jealous apprehensions of the mother are directed against Hagar and her child. Usage, stronger than written law, gives to the chief wife in the tent of wandering pastoral people unlimited authority over her female slaves. Hagar had already been exposed to the jealousy of Sarah when, previous to the birth of Ishmael, she had been treated with such harshness as to fly into the wilderness, whence she had returned by the direction of an angel. Sarah now insists, and Abraham, receiving a divine intimation as to the destiny of the elder born, complies with her demand that Hagar and Ishmael should be sent forth to seek their fortune in some of the unoccupied and uncultivated districts which lay around. The supply of provisions which they carried from the tent of Abraham soon failed, and the mother and the youth wandered into a district which was destitute of water. History or poetry scarcely presents us with any passage which surpasses in simple pathos the description of Hagar not daring to look upon her child while he is perishing with thirst before her face. And she went and sat her down over against him a good way off, as it were a bowshot. For she said, "Let me not see the death of the child." And she sat over against him, and lift up her voice and wept. But Ishmael likewise was to become the father of a great people. By divine interposition, Hagar discovered a well. The water restored them to life. Ishmael either joined some horde of Arabs or maintained himself in independence by his bow, till his mother obtained him an Egyptian wife. The wandering Arabs to this day, by general traditions adopted into the Quran, trace their descent to the outcast son of Abraham. The wild man whose hand is against every man, and every man's hand against him, still waylays the traveler by the fountain, or sweeps his rapid troop of horse across the track of the wealthy caravan. The faith of Abraham was to pass through a more trying ordeal. He is suddenly commanded to cut off that life on which all the splendid promises of the Almighty seemed to depend. He obeys and sets forth with his unsuspecting child to offer the fatal sacrifice on Mount Moriah. The immolation of human victims, particularly of the most precious, the favorite, the firstborn child, appears as a common usage among many early nations, more especially the tribes by which Abraham was surrounded. It was the distinguishing rite among the worshippers of Moloch at a later period of the Jewish history. It was practiced by a king of Moab. It was undoubtedly derived by the Carthaginians from their Phoenician ancestors on the shores of Syria. The offering of Isaac bears no resemblance, either in its nature or what may be termed its moral purport, to these horrid rites. Where it was an ordinary usage, as in the worship of Moloch, it was in unison with the character of the religion and of the deity. It was the last act of a dark and sanguinary superstition, which rose by regular gradation to this complete triumph over human nature. The God who was propitiated by these offerings had been satiated with more cheap and vulgar victims. He had been glutted to the full with human suffering and with human blood. In general, it was the final mark of the subjugation of the national mind to an inhuman and domineering priesthood. But the Hebrew religion held human sacrifices in abhorrence. The God of the Abrahamitic family, uniformly beneficent imposed no duties which entailed human suffering, demanded no offerings which were repugnant to the better feelings of our nature, where, on the other hand, these filial sacrifices were of rare and extraordinary occurrence. They were either to expiate some dreadful guilt, to avert the imminent vengeance of the offended deity, or to extort his blessing on some important enterprise. But the offering of Isaac was neither peculiar or propitiatory. Abraham had committed no guilt and apprehended no danger. The immolation of his only son seemed forever to deprive him of that blessing which was nearest to his heart, the parentage of a numerous and powerful tribe. It was a simple act of unhesitating obedience to the divine command, the last proof of perfect reliance on the certain accomplishment of the divine promises. Isaac, so miraculously bestowed, could be as miraculously restored. Abraham, such is the comment of the Christian apostle, believed that God could even raise him up from the dead. Still, while the great example of primitive piety appears no less willing to offer the most precious victim on the altar of his God than the idolaters around him, the God of the Hebrews maintains his benign and beneficent character. After everything is prepared, the wool of the altar laid, even the sacrificial knife uplifted, the arm of the Father is arrested, a single ram, entangled by his horns in a thicket, is substituted, and Abraham called the name of the place Jehovah-Jireh, the Lord will provide. Near this same spot, 18 centuries after, Jesus Christ was offered, the victim, as the Christian world has almost universally believed, provided by the Lord. Inexplicable, if undesigned, coincidence. This last trial of his faith thus passed, the promise of the divine blessing was renewed to Abraham in still more express and vivid terms. His seed were to be numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sands of the seashore. Their enemies were to fall before them, and the whole world was to receive some remote and mysterious blessing through the channel of this favored race. After this epoch, the incidents in the life of Abraham are less important, yet still characteristic of the age and the state of society. He lived on terms of amity with the native princes, particularly with Abimelech, the king of Gerar, on whose territories his encampment at one time bordered. With Abimelech an adventure took place, so similar in its circumstances with the seizure and restoration of Sarah in Egypt, as almost to excite a suspicion that it is a traditional variation of the same transaction, more particularly as it is unquestionably related out of its place in the Mosaic narrative, and again repeated in the life of Isaac. Abimelech permitted the stranger sheik to pitch his tent and pasture his flocks and herds in any part of his domains. The only dispute related to the valuable possession of a well, and this was prudently and amicably arranged. The death of Sarah gave occasion for another friendly treaty with the native princes. Every independent tribe has its separate place of burial. The family union continues in the grave. The patriarch or parent of the tribe has the place of honor in the common cemetery, which is usually hewn out of the rock, sometimes into spacious chambers, supported by pillars and with alcoves in the sides where the coffins are deposited. Each successive generation, according to the common expression, is gathered to their fathers. On Abraham's demand for permission to purchase a place of sepulture, the chiefs of the tribe of Het assemble to debate the weighty question. The first resolution is to offer the rich and popular stranger the unusual privilege of interring his dead in their national sepulchres. As this might be misconstrued into a formal union between the clans, Abraham declines the hospitable offer. He even refuses as a gift and insists on purchasing, for 400 pieces of silver, a field named Machpelah, surrounded by trees, in which stood a rock well suited for sepulchral excavation. Here, unmingled with those of any foreign tribe, his own remains and those of Sarah are to repose. In another important instance, the isolation of the Abrahamitic family and its pure descent from the original Mesopotamian stock is carefully kept up. The wife of Isaac is sought not among their Canaanitish neighbors, but among his father's kindred in Canaan. At a later period, the same feeling of attachment to the primitive tribe and aversion from mingling with the idolatrous Canaanites is shown in the condemnation of Esau for taking his wives from the inhabitants of the country, which were a grief of mind unto Isaac and to Rebekah, while Jacob is sent to seek a wife in the old Mesopotamian settlement. So completely does the seclusion and separation of Abraham and his descendants run through the whole history. Abraham solemnly adjures his most faithful servant, whom he dispatches to Canaan on this matrimonial mission for his son, to discharge his embassage with fidelity. Having sworn by the singular ceremony of placing his hand under his master's thigh, a custom of which the origin is unknown, the servant sets off with his camels and arrives in safety near the old encampment of the tribe. At the usual place of meeting, the well, he encounters Rebekah, the beautiful daughter of Bethuel, the son of Abraham's brother, Nahor. The courteous maiden assists him in watering his camels. Her relations receive him with equal hospitality. The intelligence of Abraham's wealth, confirmed by the presence of gold and jewels which he produced, make them consent with alacrity to the betrothing of the damsel to the son of Abraham. The messenger and Rebekah reach in safety the encampment of Abraham, and Isaac, when he hears the sound of the returning camels, beholds a fair maiden modestly veiled, whom he conducts and puts in possession of the tent of his mother Sarah, that which belonged to the chief wife of the head of the tribe. After the death of Sarah, Abraham took another wife, Keturah, by whom he had many children. Isaac, however, continued his sole heir. The rest were sent away into the east country. Their descendants are frequently recognized among the people noticed in the Jewish annals, but always as aliens from the stock of Abraham. At length the patriarch died and was buried in Machpelah by Ishmael and Isaac, who met in perfect amity to perform the last duty to the head and father of their tribes. I will pick up from here next time.